Welcome to Becoming Untriggered, a podcast brought to you by psychodynamic coaches and parents of three, Lavinia Brown and Andrew Lynn.
Together we normalise and unpack common challenges faced by couples and parents, explore how these could be symptoms of unprocessed trauma, and support you with the tried and tested tools for you to show up as the mum or dad, partner, and person you deserve to be. Welcome to Becoming Untriggered podcast. Today we are looking at repair. What is repair? When is it necessary? Is it enough? And could there be a time when it's too late to put in the repair? So we're going to look at how repair works and whether sometimes you need something more than repair because it's not a sufficient strategy on its own.
Yeah, so generally there are two types of repair. There's the short-term repair, which is trying to change something after an event happens, which is a bit of a band-aid, unless there is long-term change. The second type is long-term repair, where you're actually changing the environment, you're changing the child's experience in the long term, you're changing as individuals, as parents.
Yeah, so I think most of our listeners would associate repair as what comes after rupture. It's quite a new concept that when you do something that is not in alignment with the parent that you want to be, you take responsibility for it. You say you shouldn't have done it. You acknowledge that there was a rupture. And then you make sure that the child knows what they did was their fault, but the way you reacted was your fault.
Well, I think to acknowledge that repair is required, then you need to acknowledge that you've done something wrong in the first place. And I think that was the challenging part for me in the early part of my parenting journey. Maybe that was too fragile for me. That was too vulnerable for me. Maybe I was trying to be a good parent, and a lot of my parenting identity was tied up with doing things differently to my dad, and I was trying my best to do the right thing.
I think you're right. You have to have the awareness of the relativity of what the word wrong means. Is it in alignment with who you want to be? I think a lot of mums, for sure, have an idea of the kind of mum they want to be, perhaps fueled in an unhealthy way by social media. There's all these perfect people with their highlight reels of perfect parenting. So we all know what we're meant to be doing. Obviously, we're human beings. We make mistakes. We fall short. So it's acknowledging that. I think it's not necessarily seeing that you didn't do it perfectly, but it's feeling inside that you didn't react in a way that you wanted to. Maybe I was more aware of it than you were because I was naturally, perhaps as a woman, I'm going to generalize, but the footing that I was on was, I've done it wrong, I'll need to improve. Whereas I think your footing was, I'm not as bad as my dad, I'm doing all right.
Yeah, I think it's complicated for everybody. But looking back at my journey, I hadn't done any of this work. So I hadn't unpacked anything. And that's where a lot of people start this journey. It's no coincidence that people come to us to do this work when they have kids, because you're forced to do it. So there's a really good chance that the first experiences your children have are of you before shining a light on all of your stuff, before unpacking everything, before becoming conscious of what you're doing.
Yeah, and I just want to touch on that point because a lot of my women, and actually my slogan on my homepage is stop parenting like your parents. And that's where a lot of the repair comes in, I think, because until you do this work, you do unconsciously parent like your parents, even if that's the thing you last wanted to do. You were dead set on being a different kind of mum. I guess there's two conflicting messages. I always say to mums, it's not your fault. It's really important to recognize that. When you're in a trauma response, it's because old stuff is being stirred up. That prefrontal cortex goes offline. So you're kind of not responsible for what you do. Your limbic system kicks in and you will probably end up doing what your parents did to you. You're not conscious. So I think it's really important to underline that because women can naturally think, my kids would be better off without me. And it's not just like, oh, it's not my fault. It doesn't matter what I do. You have to acknowledge that going into a trauma response when your child does something isn't okay. So the repair is necessary for sure when you realize that you're parenting like your parents, even though parenting like your parents isn't necessarily something conscious.
There's a lot to unpack there, but I think that's the first thing to recognize, that repair would only ever be needed when the response is disproportionate. And if the response is disproportionate, then you know you've been triggered and therefore you're offline. So again, that's your work. In terms of repair, the kid's got no idea what's going on. They don't need to know the justification of that, but maybe there's an opportunity to apologize. I think being open and honest is really important at that part of time. I think kids respond to that. That wasn't fair. I'm sorry. I was triggered even. You didn't deserve that. All of these types of things.
What you've just said is a really good point, because I think some of my clients think that this is repair and it's not. The justification. We've had this with a couple of our couples people, that when they realize they've been triggered, they put in the repair and they say, I'm sorry, I did this because, and then they go into their story of how their inner child was triggered because of something that happened in the past, which is amazing. It's very vulnerable. It's very open. It's showing a real commitment to working through something by understanding the reason. But a kid does not need to know that, because that's kind of getting them to pity you, or it's giving a context to your behavior that isn't relevant to them.
No, and your kid will start caretaking you, and your kid will
Exactly.
start feeling parentified, like they're taking on all of that information, taking on all that trauma. So that's not necessarily at all. You can say, I'm triggered, I got some emotion from the past, hijacked me, and I shouldn't have projected it onto you. Really sorry. And that is significant for the kid. I see sometimes, like I said to you earlier, when I make some mistakes, when I do some things I don't want to do with the kids, I don't give them enough attention, they feel rejected, they feel like I'm not seeing them. That repair does really bring them back. It does reconnect after that rupture.
Yeah, I think it's really important. So it's saying sorry, it's acknowledging that your behavior wasn't as you wished it to be. And then I think a really important part of it is saying that you're really trying to improve and to change. And a lot of mums come to me going, yeah, but what's the point? I'm putting the repair every day and I'm doing the same thing every day. Is it worth it? The answer's got to be, of course it is. Yes. And I'm trying really hard. I know it might not look like it because I keep reacting in the same way, but I am trying. And maybe you can say, I'm getting help on this. I want to be the best mummy that you deserve. And I think kids do get that. I've said this story many times as well. This one, I remember when we did the love game. We used to do it at Christmas, and we went round the table saying, what is it that you love about one person most? And then took turns. And one of our children said to me, I love that you try so hard. Oh my God, that floored me, because it made me realize I am not perfect. I mean, I knew that bit, but what I realized was that they know I'm not perfect all too well. And that's not actually what's going in. What's going in is that they see that I'm trying. And that felt like repair for me, actually. Them saying, we feel that we're important enough for you to put in the repair, for you to keep trying.
I think you're right, but I think the trauma or being hijacked and fracturing and then repair is important. But that's not parenting. That cycle is dysfunctional. That's not moving in the right direction. But the repair can be a bridge that helps you all on a longer term healing journey. Because if you keep doing the same mistakes and keep apologizing, then suddenly, very quickly, the apology is not going to mean anything. In some ways, there's no use putting in repair unless you're on a healing journey, unless you're getting better, unless you're creating significant change that you can say you're trying, that you can give your child a different experience. And just being aware of your triggers and trying not to do it again, we know is not enough.
Well, some people don't have the tools. We do have the tools. We can teach them. And a lot of it is about release of the backlog of resentment, anger, frustration, pain that is in you, that comes out every time that trigger comes up. You know, I remember having a big fallout, big rupture, and then vowing to myself, okay, this cannot go on. I have to find what this trigger is and deal with it. And actually, my biggest healing of that was releasing the pent up old backlog of crap that I was feeling towards this child. It wasn't about what they'd done in that moment. And it wasn't really about my childhood, actually. It was about the build-up of rupture that had happened in our dynamic over a certain number of years. And can I say something about not passing on your trauma? Because this is a really big thing for a lot of my clients. They're like, have I passed on my trauma? How do I know if I haven't? How can I deal with it if I have? We talked about parenting like your parents, and the context within which you parent like your parents is crucial. Taking an example, hitting. I hope people understand that's not what I'm condoning. And also that there's no shame, because you can heal this and you can stop. If you are doing that and it looks identical to how your parents did it, hopefully you have set up a very different context within which that behavior took place. Your children know that you love them. You are emotionally mature enough to tell them that they are loved on a regular basis. You connect with them physically. You put in that repair. And that's a kind of buffer, which we talked about last session. How do you make your kids feel safe in an unsafe world? That's a kind of buffer that takes you through trauma. So yes, whatever you've done might be traumatic, but if it's a blip within a much more predictable, less volatile, safe, loving environment on the whole, it's not going to have the same effect on your child that it did on you, where there wasn't that context, where no one told you they loved you, where no one ever took responsibility for their actions. I think that's really important.
I mean, there aren't many situations that we come across where people we work with aren't giving a significantly better experience to their children than they had.
Exactly.
But also on that point, I think, have I traumatized my children? You can work within this boundary of safety that you're talking about there. And the repair does work in the short term if you're working within this bound of safety. But if you do create a rupture that takes your child outside of that boundary of safety, that creates the emotional overload and the emotional repression that creates the trauma, so it's still alive with them, that fear of being hit or whatever it is, then repair is not going to touch the sides with that. And it, again, there's probably nothing you can do in the short term, apart from acknowledge that that's an experience that they had. But in the long term, when you learn to regulate your own nervous system and you learn to release your own trauma from the repressed emotion, then that is something that you could potentially teach your child to do. So even if you have given your kids these big traumatic experiences that have lived with you for decades, they don't necessarily have to live with your kids for decades.
Yeah, I think there are two different ways that there can be a long-term effect. It will either create an adaptive behavior, a kind of coping mechanism. They'll become a more submissive, people-pleasing type of child as a result, which is kind of just as bad as having a fragmented memory of a very scary experience. I feel like I've passed on two different kinds of trauma to our two eldest. I like, as a practice, to once in a while ask them a question when it's appropriate and it's calm and they've got your attention. Something like, is there anything I could do to parent differently or to parent better? And that is a really good conversation to have, because it opens up that space for them to bring up things that they might have been holding on to. And one of my children has gone, yes, you could become in general. And the other child did have a fragmented memory of my disembodied voice and a feeling of fear. And we tried to track it down to what it was or what happened, and they couldn't. But that, at least they were made to feel that they weren't carrying it on their own. That's my long-term repair that I like to do from time to time, because I think that's really important for, like you said, the stuff that gets stuck.
Yeah, I think that's a really good example. Creating the space to bring it up, because the only reason it's still there, even 2 years later, is because there's a repression of it, an unconscious repression of it from the kid. If you can guide them and create space for them to connect to the emotions that are around and voice any of the experiences that come up for them, that is really healing.
And kind of just acknowledging how cutting edge this is, really. I mean, we don't know. I don't know whether that experience with both of my eldest kids is going to have an impact long term. I don't know. They're not old enough to seek therapy yet. So I'm just kind of assuming that it will. But our parents never did anything like that. They didn't even do the short-term repair. we're like really cutting edge here. We are being pioneers of a new way of showing up, both in the short term and long term. And we can't know that it's the right thing to do or the wrong thing because we don't know. No generation has ever been through this experiment.
I agree, but it's fairly plain for me to see that their whole experience is changed after that release. After that, I'm not holding on to it all anymore. I've been seen. So we kind of moved on there in terms of release, long-term release for significant trauma. But I want to talk about another type of repair that is the adaptive behavior, actually. And that still comes from an emotional trauma. So the adaptive behavior comes from parenting that isn't traumatic, but it's about creating rules, environments. It might not even be that. It could be we're really happy. We're not sad around here. It's even conditional love. And very early, kids learn to play by those rules, and it creates this trauma because they perceive that, my authentic self isn't lovable. I need to achieve things. I need to do this. And that creates this adaptive behavior of the little people pleaser or the good girl that's got a load of repressed anger. Early on, we can create these traumas, these fragmented inner child, even within our children, that creates these adaptive behaviors. And repair can be put in around these things.
Then again, like we said at the beginning, part of it, I think, is admitting it, saying, I wasn't a great parent when you came along, especially with our firstborns. I feel that parenting happens in symbiosis with your child. We don't know how to parent. No one gives you the rule book. And you will become the kind of parent that your child needs, as well as being the kind of parent that you experienced. It's this weird mix. Only through being aware of where you're falling short, being aware of how that might be linked to how you were parented, and being aware of the impact it has on your child, that's how you grow alongside them. So some people sometimes think, I shouldn't have kids until I'm healed. It's not possible because a whole load of stuff will come up when you become a parent. I think for me, it's a balance of acceptance that you will have passed some stuff on. It's inevitable, especially from the beginning. So your first child may well have more wounding as a result of you than your second or third because you've healed. And being in that conscious, continual relationship with yourself. What kind of mum do I want to be? What do I need in order to get there? How can I show my children that I am trying, getting the support that I need in order to stick to what I've said?
First of all, I think the long-term repair happens more organically in terms of you turning up differently as a person in the house when you're on your healing journey. Because you can't make things conscious in your parenting, they're still unconscious within you. So if you're a people pleaser and you don't know it because you're happy and your childhood was great and you've got a good job and everything's fine, you're naturally just going to parent that same way. There's two different sides. There's giving them love, which gives them a good sound foundation of self-love. And then there's creating these adaptive behaviors with the conditional love, using the carrot, They're going to mold their behavior to that. And it's not necessarily good for them, as you find out as an adult when you go through your healing journey and see where your dysfunction is and see where your unhappiness comes from, your disconnection comes from. So it's about being conscious of yourself. What's driving my behaviors? Why am I doing this? Why am I doing this when it's not serving me? How can I do stuff that's more connected and more present for me? And that's when you think, I see that in my kids, or I do that to my kids. And when you make it conscious within you and you see the dysfunction that's caused, even though it might have caused some positive things. So being a people pleaser means that sometimes you're successful.
So in a way, there's a short-term repair. You shouted when you shouldn't have done. You had a disproportionate reaction. You say sorry, take responsibility, say that you're trying to be better. There's the longer-term repair. What could I do to be a better parent? And being able to accept whatever it is that your child tells you, committing to trying to change that and holding space for whatever it is that they may have repressed until that moment. And then there's the really long-term repair, which is, I think, is less conscious. It happens naturally. As you heal and change and you love your inner child, you are naturally more able to love your children. You don't really need to try at that. As long as you're putting in the effort to change, that long-term repair will happen. So you kind of got to trust that putting yourself first and your wounds first is actually also rubbing off on everyone else.
100%. I think the main benefits of being on your own healing journey is turning up more present, more embodied, more safe in yourself, in your own body, and more self-loving. And really, that's the environment all the children need.
If what we discussed was helpful, please subscribe and leave us a 5-star review. For more of the same, check out my social media, The Inner Child Healing Expert, or to work with me, go to laviniabrown.com.
You can find me on andrewlynn.net or Life Coach for Dads on Instagram. We work with both individuals and couples. If there are any topics you'd like us to cover, please reach out. Thanks for listening.